People don't walk away from the most dangerous man in the city because they're weak. They walk away because they forget he's still human. I took the job on a rainy Monday morning because my checking account had less than $40 in it. My rent was already 5 days late, and my 6-year-old son deserved a future that wasn't measured by overdue notices taped to our apartment door. Every employment agency in Manhattan had warned me about the position before they even handed me the address. Personal assistant. Live-in optional. Exceptional salary. No applicant had lasted longer than 1 day. Some quit before lunch. Others walked out without collecting their pay. One woman reportedly burst into tears before the interview was over. I almost laughed when I heard the stories because fear had become a luxury I couldn't afford. My name is Emma Brooks. I'm 31 years old, a single mother, and every decision I make begins with the same question. Will this help Noah? If the answer is yes, I keep moving, even when my knees want to give out. The taxi stopped in front of iron gates taller than any house I'd ever lived in. Beyond them stood an estate that looked less like a home and more like something history had forgotten to tear down. Limestone walls, endless windows reflecting gray skies, perfect gardens untouched by fallen leaves despite the October wind. Everything whispered money. Old money. The driver glanced at me through the mirror before I stepped out. You sure this is the place? He asked. I smiled, even though my stomach had already tied itself into knots. I'm sure. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they think you're making a mistake but know they can't stop you. A security guard opened the gate before I reached the intercom. He already knew my name. That unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Another man in a charcoal suit met me halfway up the stone walkway. His expression never changed. Ms. Brooks. That's me. Follow me. We walked through hallways so quiet I could hear the soft click of my shoes against polished marble. Expensive paintings covered every wall. Crystal chandeliers reflected morning light across ceilings that seemed impossibly high. Yet none of it felt warm. Wealth usually tried to impress people. This place didn't care whether anyone was impressed. It expected obedience instead. We stopped outside 2 massive wooden doors. The man finally looked at me. If Mr. Moretti tells you to leave, you leave. If he asks a question, answer honestly. If he dismisses you, do not argue. I nodded. Understood. He opened the doors without another word. The office was enormous, lined with dark bookshelves and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. At first I thought the room was empty. Then I noticed the wheelchair facing the glass. The man sitting there never turned around. Broad shoulders filled a perfectly tailored black shirt. Intricate tattoos climbed above his collar, disappearing beneath the fabric before continuing down both arms where the sleeves had been rolled neatly to his forearms. Even from behind, he carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed without raising his voice. Silence stretched between us. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Finally he spoke. They told you everyone quits. His voice was calm, deep, almost conversational. Yes. Then why are you still standing there? I looked toward the river instead of searching for the right answer. Because my son doesn't get to quit needing me. Another long silence followed. I expected him to laugh, or dismiss me, or call security. Instead, he slowly turned his wheelchair until I met a pair of pale blue eyes sharper than the October air outside. They studied me without hurry, as though measuring every promise I'd ever broken and every burden I'd ever carried. Most people come here looking for money, he said quietly. What are you looking for? I took one steady breath before answering. A chance to prove everyone else wrong. The corner of Damian Moretti's mouth moved just enough to suggest that he had almost smiled, but the expression disappeared before I could be certain it had ever existed. Everyone says that during the interview, he said. By sunset they remember they have somewhere else to be. I held his gaze. I cannot promise that I will never leave. I can only promise that I will not leave before I have actually tried. His eyes remained fixed on mine for another long moment before he reached for a leather folder resting on the polished desk beside him. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, and completely free of self-pity. He slid the folder across the desk without another word. Inside were pages filled with schedules, meetings, medical appointments, business calls, and handwritten notes in flawless block letters. Every hour of every day had already been planned with military precision. Read page 12, he said. I flipped through the binder until I found it. At the top, in bold letters, someone had written rules for my assistant. The list stretched nearly 2 full pages. Never interrupt. Never touch the wheelchair without permission. Never rearrange the office. Never ask personal questions. Never show pity. Never lie. Never arrive late. Never leave early. Never assume silence means agreement. I quietly finished reading before closing the binder. Anything else? I asked. Most people complain before they reach the second page. Complaining would not change the rules. His expression stayed unreadable. Interesting answer. A gentle knock interrupted us. An older woman stepped inside carrying a silver tray with coffee and fresh pastries. She smiled warmly at me before setting everything down. Good morning, Mr. Moretti. Thank you, Margaret. She nodded politely toward me. You must be Emma. Yes, ma'am. Welcome. There was genuine kindness in her voice, but beneath it I caught something else. Concern. As if she hoped I might stay while already expecting that I would not. She quietly left the room, closing the heavy doors behind her. Damien picked up his coffee without looking away from the city outside the window. Margaret has worked here for 22 years. Everyone else comes and goes. I looked down at the untouched pastries. Do you ever eat breakfast? When I remember. That explains the coffee. His head turned slightly. Excuse me. Coffee is not breakfast. Silence filled the room again. I wondered if I had crossed an invisible line. Instead of answering, he lifted the cup and took another sip. Your file says you worked as an office manager for almost 7 years. Then why are you unemployed? Because the company closed after a merger. That is unfortunate. Life keeps moving. You make everything sound simple. I thought about Noah eating cereal before school that morning, pretending not to notice I had skipped breakfast again. Simple and easy are not the same thing. His fingers rested lightly on the armrest of the wheelchair. Tattooed lines disappeared beneath the cuff of his shirt, intricate designs that hinted at stories I knew better than to ask about. He finally closed the folder. Your first assignment is organizing the correspondence waiting outside this office. Separate personal letters from business documents. Do not open anything marked private. Understood. You have 1 hour. I stepped into the hallway where 3 assistants in dark suits watched me with quiet curiosity. One of them, a man about my age named Vincent, pointed towards several neatly stacked boxes. Those are yours. That is all, I asked. He looked genuinely surprised. Usually this is where people start asking how soon lunch is. I smiled. It is only 9:30. He laughed softly. Maybe you really are different. The letters filled nearly 2 large storage boxes. Invitations, contracts, charity requests, handwritten notes from hospitals, schools, churches, and families asking for help. I had expected paperwork connected only to business. Instead, I found evidence that people across the city believed Damien Moretti could solve problems no one else could. I did not read the private contents, but the names alone painted a picture that did not match the rumors. Nearly an hour passed before I heard the quiet sound of wheels approaching across the marble floor. Damien stopped beside the table without saying anything. His sharp blue eyes moved across the perfectly organized stacks before settling on the single envelope resting separately at the corner. Why is that one alone? He asked. I looked up. Because it is addressed in a child's handwriting. I thought you might want to open that one first. For the first time since walking into the estate, the cold distance in his expression shifted into something quieter, something almost impossible to recognize. He reached for the envelope carefully, holding it longer than any business contract I had seen on the table, and without looking at me, he said, almost under his breath, "You notice things that other people ignore." I expected Damien Moretti to test my patience. I did not expect him to test every quiet promise I had ever made to myself. The second day began before sunrise when Vincent knocked gently on the guest room door and informed me that my schedule had changed. Mr. Moretti wanted every meeting moved forward by 2 hours. 20 minutes later, he canceled half of them without explanation. By 8 o'clock, he requested files from the library. By 8:15, he decided he wanted financial reports instead. At 8:30, he asked why the reports had not already been on his desk. I answered every question with the same steady voice I used when Noah spilled cereal before school or woke from a nightmare convinced monsters lived in the closet. Getting frustrated never solved the problem in front of me. Solving the problem did. By mid-morning, I had memorized the layout of the estate, learned the names of every employee, and figured out which printer jammed every third document. Margaret watched me quietly while preparing tea in the kitchen. You have not complained once, she said. I smiled while arranging a tray. Would it help if I did? She laughed softly. Not around here. When I returned to the office, Damien was studying the skyline through the tall windows again. Clouds drifted over Manhattan, turning the Hudson River into a sheet of silver. He did not look at me when I placed the tea beside him. You forgot the lemon. I glanced at the tray. He was right. I will be back in 1 minute. Too slow. I walked to the kitchen, brought back fresh lemon slices, and set them beside his cup without rushing. He watched every movement carefully. You are not embarrassed? He asked. Everyone forgets something. Perfection matters. Improvement matters more. His eyes narrowed slightly. That sounds like something from a motivational poster. I almost laughed. No. It sounds like something a mother learns after cleaning the same mess for the 100th time. For a brief second, the corner of his mouth moved again before his expression returned to its familiar calm. The moment disappeared so quickly that I wondered if I had imagined it. The afternoon became even stranger. Damien asked me to reorganize his calendar 3 separate times. Each version contradicted the last. He instructed me to cancel a charity luncheon, then asked why the cancellation notice had already been sent. He questioned small details that most people would never notice, from the spacing of folders on the bookshelf to the angle of a fountain pen resting beside his notebook. I began to understand why no assistant stayed. None of these tasks were impossible. They were exhausting because every decision felt like another invisible examination. Shortly after 3 o'clock, Vincent entered carrying several contracts that required signatures. Damien reviewed each page with remarkable focus before signing them in smooth, confident strokes. Watching him work challenged everything I had assumed. His wheelchair never defined the room. He did. Every conversation adjusted to his pace. Every person measured their words before speaking. Authority surrounded him as naturally as sunlight filled the windows. When Vincent left, Damien looked toward me again. Most people think they understand me after one day. I do not think I understand you at all. Does that bother you? I shook my head. People are not puzzles that need to be solved immediately. He rested one tattooed hand lightly on the desk. Then what am I? I answered before fear had the chance to interrupt. A man who expects everyone to leave before they have the chance to stay. The silence that followed felt different from every silence before it. It was not cold. It was thoughtful. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the tall windows. Inside, the estate remained perfectly still. Damien slowly looked away from me toward the city below. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. You should be careful, Emma. About what? The longer you stay here, the harder it becomes to remember where my world ends and yours begins. Saturday arrived with the first clear sky I had seen all week. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, softening the sharp lines of the estate, but it did nothing to change the quiet that lived inside its walls. I had just finished organizing Damien's afternoon schedule when my phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen lit up with the picture of Noah smiling with 2 missing front teeth. I answered immediately. Hi, buddy. His cheerful voice filled my ear. Mom, Miss Carter says the school carnival is next Friday. Can you come? My heart tightened. I would not miss it for anything. Promise. I promise. He paused before adding, Did your new boss yell today? I smiled despite myself. Not yet. Noah laughed. That means he likes you. Children had a way of reaching conclusions adults would spend years trying to understand. After the call ended, I slipped the phone back into my pocket and noticed Damien watching me from across the office. Your son? He asked. Yes. He sounds happy. He tries very hard to be. Damien lowered his eyes to the document in front of him, but he did not continue reading. Bring him here tomorrow. I blinked. Tomorrow. It is Sunday. There are no meetings. I do not think that is appropriate. Why? Because I work here. Exactly. His answer made no sense, yet he spoke as though it required no explanation. Before I could respond, Margaret entered carrying fresh coffee. She looked from Damien to me with quiet curiosity. Everything all right? Damien answered before I could. Emma is bringing her son tomorrow. Margaret's eyes widened for just a second before a gentle smile appeared. I think that would be lovely. I looked at both of them. Somehow the decision had already been made without me. The next afternoon, I parked my aging sedan outside the estate with Noah sitting beside me in his favorite blue sweatshirt, his sneakers swinging above the floor because he had not quite grown into them yet. He stared through the windshield at the enormous gates. "Mom," he whispered, "does a movie star live here?" I laughed softly. "No, just someone who values privacy." Noah climbed out holding my hand, his small backpack bouncing against his shoulders. The security guard smiled politely at him, something I had never seen them do with anyone else. Children changed the atmosphere simply by existing. Inside the house, Noah's eyes grew wider with every room we passed. He stopped in front of a grand piano taller than he was. "Can people really play this?" he asked. "Some people can," Margaret answered warmly as she approached with a tray of cookies and milk. "Would you like one?" Noah looked at me first. I nodded, and he accepted the cookie with both hands. "Thank you, ma'am." "Such wonderful manners," Margaret whispered after he wandered toward the library. I found Damien waiting near the fireplace. He wore a dark sweater instead of his usual tailored jacket, but his presence filled the room exactly the same way. Noah turned, spotted the wheelchair, and walked toward him without hesitation. There was no fear, no awkwardness, no curiosity disguised as politeness, only honest innocence. He stopped a few feet away and looked up at Damien. "Hi, I am Noah." Damien studied him for a moment before answering. "Damien." Noah frowned thoughtfully. "Mom said you are her boss." "She is correct." Noah glanced at the wheelchair, then back at Damien's face. "Does it hurt?" The room became completely still. Even the crackling fireplace seemed quieter. Every adult instinct in me wanted to apologize, to redirect the conversation, but Noah had asked the question with genuine concern, not judgment. Damien looked down at his hands resting on the wheels. His tattooed fingers remained perfectly still. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual distance. "Some days it does." Noah nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Then he reached into his backpack, pulled out a folded sheet of paper covered in bright crayons, and held it out. "This always helps me when I feel sad." Damien accepted the drawing carefully. It showed a little boy holding hands with his mother beneath an enormous yellow sun. Across the top, in uneven letters, Noah had written, "Everybody needs someone to come home to." Damien stared at the picture for several long seconds, and for the first time since I had met him, the silence around him no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a door that had quietly begun to open. After Noah and I drove home that evening, I could not stop thinking about the way Damien had looked at my son's drawing. It was not the expression of a man who had been impressed. It was the expression of someone who had remembered a part of himself he had buried a long time ago. Monday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and a layer of silver fog drifting over the Hudson River. The estate was already awake when I arrived. Staff members moved quietly through the hallways, carrying trays, folders, and fresh flowers as though every day followed the same carefully rehearsed rhythm. Yet something felt different. Margaret greeted me with an unusually bright smile. "He ate breakfast today," she whispered while pouring coffee. "That may not sound important, but it is." I looked toward Damien's office. "Because he usually skips it?" She nodded. "For years." I carried the tray upstairs and found him reviewing several documents beside the windows. The drawing Noah had given him rested inside a simple wooden frame on the bookshelf instead of being tucked away in a drawer. I noticed it immediately, but said nothing. Damien looked up briefly. "You are 3 minutes early." Traffic was lighter than usual. Most people would have waited in the parking lot until the exact time. That would have wasted 3 minutes. He gave a slight nod before handing me a folder. "You are coming with me today." "Where are we going?" "A community rehabilitation center." The answer surprised me. During the drive, I sat in the front passenger seat while Vincent drove through Manhattan. Damien remained in the back, quietly reviewing notes on a digital tablet. We crossed neighborhoods where luxury towers slowly gave way to older brick buildings, small family restaurants, playgrounds, and schools letting children out for recess. When we arrived, dozens of volunteers were preparing boxes filled with food, books, blankets, and medical supplies. Several people smiled warmly the moment they saw Damien. They did not greet him with fear. They greeted him with gratitude. A gray-haired director shook his hand carefully before turning toward me. "He has supported this place for years," she said. "Without him, many of our therapy programs would have disappeared." I looked toward Damien, who was already speaking quietly with a young physical therapist about new equipment for children recovering from serious illnesses. There was no audience, no photographers, no reporters, Only people who genuinely needed help. For the next 2 hours, I organized paperwork while watching him move from room to room. Every conversation was patient. Every question was thoughtful. He remembered names, birthdays, treatment updates, and scholarship applications without checking a single note. The image the world carried of him and the man standing before me refused to fit together. On the drive back, curiosity finally overcame caution. Why does almost nobody know you support that center? Damien kept looking out the window. Because they deserve help, not publicity. His answer lingered in the quiet space between us. Later that afternoon, while filing older records in the estate library, I accidentally discovered a worn leather album that had been placed on the wrong shelf. I intended only to return it, but one loose photograph slipped onto the floor. It showed a much younger Damien standing beside an older couple in front of a small family restaurant. His smile reached his eyes in a way I had never seen before. There were no expensive suits, no imposing estate, no carefully guarded distance. Just an ordinary young man with tattooed arms wrapped around the people he loved. Before I could place the photograph back inside, a calm voice came from behind me. They believed kindness was the only wealth worth protecting. I turned to find Damien waiting in the doorway. I quietly handed him the photograph. Your parents. He nodded once. His eyes remained on the faded picture. Everything I built was supposed to make them proud. He paused for several seconds before speaking again. Instead, life gave me lessons I never asked for. There was no bitterness in his voice, only exhaustion that had settled there over many years. As he closed the album gently, I realized something important. The wheelchair had never been the heaviest thing he carried. It was the silence that came after losing the life he once believed would always be waiting for him. The following Thursday began with an uneasy stillness that settled over the estate before sunrise. The sky outside was clear, yet every person working inside the house seemed quieter than usual. Vincent answered phone calls in short, careful sentences. Margaret walked through the kitchen with her usual grace, but I noticed she checked the hallway more often than normal. Even the security staff outside the windows appeared more alert, exchanging brief conversations through their earpieces before returning to their posts. Nothing looked wrong, yet everything felt different. I carried Damien's morning schedule into his office and immediately realized he had not touched the coffee waiting beside him. Instead, he was studying several financial reports spread neatly across the desk. His expression remained calm, but his attention was sharper than I had ever seen it. Good morning, I said. Good morning, Emma. He slid one folder toward me. 3 meetings have been canceled. Because of the weather? Because plans change. I looked through the updated calendar. Should I notify everyone? Already done. His answer was short, though not unfriendly. As I organized the remaining appointments, 2 men I had never seen before entered the office carrying sealed document cases. They greeted Damien with quiet respect before disappearing into the conference room across the hall. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute, but it confirmed something I had slowly begun to understand. Much of Damien's work happened beneath the surface, away from public attention, guided by preparation instead of panic. Around noon, Vincent asked if I could help review several digital archives that had recently been transferred to a secure server. Most of the files contained contracts, charitable foundation records, employee benefits, scholarship applications, and property maintenance reports. The work was repetitive but straightforward until one folder caught my attention. It contained duplicate copies of reports that had already been finalized months earlier. The dates were current, but the information belonged to older files. I frowned and opened another folder. The same pattern appeared again. Several records had been quietly duplicated, then placed inside unrelated directories. Nothing had been deleted, but someone had created enough confusion to make important information difficult to locate. I immediately walked upstairs carrying my laptop. Damien looked up as I entered. Something is wrong? He asked. I placed the computer on his desk and showed him the duplicate files. I might be mistaken, but these records do not belong where they are. He examined the screen without speaking. His eyes moved carefully across the file names before he opened several additional folders. 5 minutes passed in complete silence. Finally, he leaned back slightly. You found it. Found what? Someone has been quietly reorganizing internal records for weeks. Why would anyone do that? Because confusion creates opportunity. His voice remained perfectly calm, yet I sensed the importance behind every word. He pressed a button on the desk phone. "Vincent, please join us." Within moments, Vincent entered the office. Damien turned the monitor toward him. Emma noticed the duplicate archives. Vincent's expression shifted immediately. "I checked those files yesterday. I completely missed this." Damien looked toward me again. "Most people search for missing documents. You search for patterns." I shrugged gently. Years of balancing household bills teaches you to notice numbers that do not belong. Vincent quickly began comparing access logs while Damien dictated a list of accounts requiring additional review. No one raised their voice. No one blamed anyone else. The room became focused rather than frantic. Watching them work reminded me that real leadership often sounded quieter than people expected. Later that afternoon, after the immediate review had been completed, Damien asked me to remain while everyone else returned to their duties. Sunlight stretched across the office floor as he closed the final folder. "Do you know why every assistant before you failed?" he asked. I hesitated before answering. "Because they thought you were testing their patience." He slowly shook his head. "No, I was watching to see who paid attention when nobody believed they were being watched." He folded his hands together and looked directly into my eyes. "You were hired to organize my schedule. Today you protected something far more valuable. Not because I asked you to. Because you cared enough to notice." For the first time since walking through the gates of the estate, I realized my place there had quietly changed. I was no longer simply surviving each day. Without either of us saying the words aloud, trust had begun replacing distance, one small choice at a time. The changes after that afternoon were almost impossible for anyone outside the estate to notice, but I noticed them immediately. Damien no longer questioned every small decision I made. He still expected excellence. But there was a difference between demanding perfection and believing someone was capable of earning your trust. I found the second version of him hidden beneath the first. The mornings became quieter. Coffee was no longer left untouched until noon. Meetings ended with clearer decisions instead of endless revisions. Even Vincent admitted the atmosphere inside the office had changed. "You know," he said while helping me organize several scholarship applications, "Mr. Moretti has not canceled the same meeting 3 times in over a week." I smiled without looking up. Maybe everyone is simply becoming more organized. Vincent laughed softly. "No, he is." Later that day, Damien asked me to accompany him to another community center, this one serving families who had recently fallen on difficult times. Instead of remaining in the conference room, he spent nearly an hour speaking with volunteers about expanding after-school tutoring programs and providing additional technology for students. Watching him listen was even more impressive than watching him speak. He never interrupted. He remembered every name. He treated every concern as though it deserved his full attention. On the drive back, my phone buzzed. Noah's school had called. His teacher explained that he had developed a mild fever during the afternoon and wanted to go home early. My heart immediately sank. "I am sorry," I said, lowering the phone. "I need to leave as soon as possible." Damien did not hesitate. "Go. I still have several reports to finish. Your son comes first." I looked at him, surprised by how naturally those words had come. "Thank you." Vincent turned the car toward my apartment without another question. By the time I reached home, Noah was asleep beneath his favorite blanket on the couch with a cool washcloth resting across his forehead. His fever was not serious, but I stayed beside him for the rest of the evening, reading quietly while checking his temperature every hour. Around 8 o'clock, there was a gentle knock at the apartment door. I was not expecting anyone. When I opened it, Margaret stood there carrying a woven basket filled with homemade soup, fresh fruit, herbal tea, children's books, and a small stuffed bear wearing a blue scarf. "Margaret?" I asked in surprise. She smiled warmly. "Mr. Moretti thought Noah might enjoy some company while he feels better." I looked past her toward the waiting car parked along the curb. Damien was not inside. There were no photographers, no dramatic gestures, no expectation of thanks. Just kindness delivered as quietly as it had been given. Noah woke a little while later and immediately hugged the stuffed bear against his chest. "Did Grandma send this?" he whispered sleepily. I brushed his hair away from his forehead. "No, sweetheart. Was it your boss?" I nodded. Noah smiled with complete certainty. I knew he was nice. Children never seemed interested in the stories adults invented about people. They trusted what they experienced instead. The next morning, Noah's fever had already begun to disappear, and I returned to the estate carrying the empty basket. Damien was reviewing construction plans when I entered. I placed the basket gently beside his desk. "Thank you," I said. He kept looking at the papers for another moment before speaking. "How is Noah?" "Much better." He gave a small nod of relief. "Good." I hesitated before asking the question that had quietly followed me all night. "Why did you send all of that?" He finally looked up. Morning light reflected across the framed drawing Noah had given him, still resting on the bookshelf behind his desk. "Because every child deserves to know that someone remembered them." His answer settled gently into the silence between us. At that moment, I understood something that had taken everyone else years to miss. The strongest thing about Damien Moretti had never been his reputation, his wealth, or the empire people whispered about. It was the part of his heart he continued protecting, even after life had given him every reason to lock it away forever. The school carnival arrived beneath a bright October sky that smelled of fresh popcorn, apple cider, and fallen leaves. Parents filled the playground carrying cameras, folding chairs, and paper cups of hot chocolate, while children ran from one colorful booth to another with the kind of energy only happiness could create. I had almost forgotten what an ordinary afternoon felt like. Noah raced toward the ring toss with two classmates, laughing so hard that I could hear him from across the field. For a little while I stopped thinking about schedules, meetings, and responsibilities. I simply watched my son enjoy being 6 years old. My phone vibrated quietly in my coat pocket. It was a message from Vincent. There was no urgency, only a short sentence. "Mr. Moretti asked me to remind you to enjoy today. We have everything covered." I smiled at the screen before slipping the phone away. It was the first afternoon since taking the job that I had truly disconnected from work without feeling guilty. An hour later, Noah tugged gently on my sleeve. "Mom, can I show you something?" He pointed toward the far end of the parking lot, where a familiar black sedan had just arrived. Damien sat inside with the passenger window lowered slightly. He wore a simple charcoal sweater instead of his usual tailored jacket, making him look less like the intimidating businessman everyone imagined, and more like a man quietly observing a world he rarely allowed himself to enter. "He came," Noah whispered excitedly. I walked over, unsure what to say. Damien looked toward the playground, where children laughed beneath strings of orange and gold decorations. "I did not want to interrupt," he said. "I only came to deliver these." He handed me a large envelope. Inside were approval letters for 5 new scholarships that would allow children from struggling families to attend after-school programs at no cost. At the bottom of each page was the name of Noah's elementary school. "You funded all of this?" I asked quietly. He looked back toward the playground instead of answering directly. Every child deserves an opportunity before life decides how difficult it will become. Before I could respond, Noah had already run over carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate. He carefully handed one to Damien. "It is really good," he announced with complete confidence. "You should have some." Damien accepted the cup with both hands as though it were something unexpectedly precious. Noah leaned casually against the side of the wheelchair. "You know," he said, "when I was sick, I kept the bear beside my bed every night." Damien smiled faintly. "I am glad. Mom says helping people is how you become rich inside." I looked down, embarrassed. "Noah." But Damien shook his head gently. "Your mother is wiser than most adults I know." The 3 of us sat quietly near the edge of the schoolyard while autumn leaves drifted across the pavement. Nobody recognized Damien. Nobody whispered about his reputation. They only saw a quiet man sharing hot chocolate with a little boy who asked endless questions about everything from baseball to dinosaurs. As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, the principal stepped onto the small outdoor stage to thank the families who had supported the carnival. She announced that an anonymous donor had completely funded the school's reading center renovation, replacing outdated books, computers, and classroom furniture before the next semester. Parents applauded enthusiastically while searching the crowd for the generous sponsor. Damien lowered his eyes, clearly hoping to remain unnoticed. Noah looked from the stage back to Damien before whispering, "You did that too, did not you?" Damien hesitated for only a moment before answering softly, "Sometimes the best gifts are the ones nobody knows who gave them." Noah nodded as though he had just learned the most important lesson in the world. On the drive home that evening, my thoughts never left the image of Damien sitting quietly beneath the turning leaves, content to watch children laugh without needing recognition for the opportunities he created. Somewhere along the way, the man everyone feared had become the person my son trusted without hesitation. And for reasons I could no longer ignore, my own heart had begun trusting him too, not because of his influence or his wealth, but because every quiet act of kindness revealed the man he had been long before the world stopped looking closely enough to see him. 1 year passed more quietly than I ever imagined possible. Winter became spring. Spring gave way to summer. Before I realized it, the maple trees outside the estate were dressed in shades of gold once again, just as they had been on the morning I first walked through those iron gates believing I would never survive a single day. So much had changed that sometimes I wondered whether the woman I had been back then would even recognize the life standing in front of her now. The estate no longer felt cold. Fresh flowers rested on the windowsills every Monday because Noah insisted every house needed color. The grand piano echoed with simple melodies he practiced every weekend while Margaret applauded every wrong note as though it belonged in a concert hall. Vincent smiled more often than anyone thought possible. Even the employees who had spent years speaking only when necessary now lingered over breakfast conversations before beginning their work. Somewhere along the way, the building had stopped feeling like a fortress and started feeling like a home. Damien changed too, although he would probably deny it if anyone dared mention it aloud. He still expected discipline. He still noticed every misplaced document and every appointment that started 2 minutes late. His tattooed hands still rested confidently on the wheels of his chair whenever he entered a room, and people still respected the quiet authority that surrounded him. But now he laughed without immediately looking away. He stayed for dinner instead of eating alone in his office. He asked about Noah's science projects, remembered every parent-teacher conference, and somehow never forgot my birthday, even though I had never told him the date myself. One Saturday afternoon, Noah convinced Damien to judge a neighborhood pumpkin carving contest at the community center. I watched from across the room as children proudly carried over crooked jack-o'-lanterns with uneven smiles carved into them. Damien studied every single one with complete seriousness before announcing that every child deserved first place because every pumpkin reflected imagination instead of perfection. The room erupted into applause. Noah ran over and wrapped his arms around Damien without hesitation. "I knew you would say that," he laughed. Damien rested one hand gently on Noah's shoulder before looking toward me. There was warmth in his eyes that no reputation could ever hide again. Later that evening, we returned to the estate just as the sun disappeared behind the Hudson River. The sky glowed with deep shades of orange and purple while the first stars quietly appeared above the gardens. Margaret served warm apple pie in the dining room before excusing herself with a smile that suggested she already knew we needed a few minutes alone. Noah hurried upstairs carrying another drawing he wanted to finish before bedtime. The house settled into comfortable silence. Damien rolled toward the library where Noah's framed picture still rested in the same place it had occupied since that unforgettable Sunday. The colors had faded slightly over the months, but the words across the top remained perfectly clear. "Everybody needs someone to come home to." Damien looked at the drawing for a long moment before turning toward me. "Do you remember what you told me during your interview?" he asked quietly. I smiled. "I said I wanted the chance to prove everyone wrong." He nodded. "You did more than that." I shook my head gently. "No, we both did." He looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "You reminded me that strength is not measured by what a person can carry alone. Sometimes it is measured by finally allowing someone to carry hope beside you." My eyes filled with quiet tears, not from sadness, but from gratitude for every ordinary moment that had slowly become extraordinary. Upstairs, Noah called out that he had finished another picture. Damien smiled before turning his wheelchair toward the hallway. "We should go see it together." I walked beside him as we made our way toward the sound of Noah's excited voice. And for the first time in many years, I realized I was no longer thinking about survival, overdue bills, or tomorrow's worries. I was thinking about home. Looking back now, people still ask me how I managed to stay when so many others walked away. The truth is surprisingly simple. They saw a man defined by his chair, his reputation, and the walls around his life. I saw a man who never stopped searching for a reason to open one more door. And sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding someone strong enough to rescue you. Sometimes it is finding someone kind enough to remind you that your heart was never beyond saving.